I got it done at Street. Wow. It's fixed. Just kind of hopped over. We were on the track. We weren't like in the shade at all. Small. Oh, okay. Wait, are you going there tomorrow? What is our next thing? Oh, wait, it's kind of No, I already, yeah, I already.
My dad is a chief judge at the federal tax court, and I was
Oh, I didn't.
not even all my years. I do not. So he explained to me, so you're always supposed to taxes on any of that you earn back to state. Like you have like a Google place.
Yeah, I know.
Your voter registration is not like.
If you wanted to, after the election, you told me. Yeah. That's kind of, but for me too. So we should go for it. But Durham, I think, is one that's just like.
I wanted the spot behind you with that, so gross chairs, and I that one.
It's a heads up.
Yeah. I know how.
Is that your dinner?
So yeah, this is my dinner. I had a meeting at 5. This, or at least not more like Duchess, and I figured this was a lot of partial.
I guess so. I really like it.
Oh, no, I mean, don't get me wrong, I like friends in town, so there's good for me to know the story. I'm older than I just saw it, it looked
Fancy food, things they don't understand, they apparently check it out.
it's good.
Okay, it looks very healthy.
It's probably not, but it's
Yeah.
So much panic because I thought that you guys had been on Friday, and I have to.
I got a new insurance company.
Oh, we
I got an interview.
just for your chart.
Well, I wasn't there, but then when I got back,
That part of just first told you today.
are you seeing? And then you're like, oh shit, this is
That's
quick.
like,
Actually, it's not able to cover that.
well, the problem is like.
As long as he's not standing behind me.
I
I have to
know.
write my comment
Yeah, wait for.
for Chronicles.
Already. I was gonna say I'm happy to write one too, but then it's for like ICS. Good for them. Like making a student.
I read it. Because you said it's.
How long is it?
What
are you writing?
I don't know. I mean, like, pretty
As students change their registration in North Carolina, so like for the
I
principal.
started out very good.
Yeah, I did.
And then
Which, I mean, this election, they said, I feel like there's definitely no chance, like, there's something wrong in the polling. But, like, apparently Georgia's, like, kind of a sunset this year, so, like, they could have stayed.
these summits are doing like above the average, but it's still like above the average.
Yeah, something
And we're like,
I win this
I mean,
week.
we have to do a little bit more to make Georgia.
Yeah.
Or-
I remember, like, saying, like, thinking at one point, it was like, no, no, like, I promise that they said that about, like, Michelle Nunn, I said, and I was like, yes.
I'd like that.
Whatever the senatorial elections were, and they kept saying she was, like, 2 points behind, and she lost by, like, 7. Like, the polling was just way off.
Yeah, get out and vote.
Okay.
So hopefully it gets better.
I hope so.
I was like,
Because
from now on, I will never
I
trust
studied
anyone.
more these and then I take a quiz and I'm like,
Last
this is a lot
semester,
of pain.
I had a student come up to me after the quiz and she was like, I know this isn't your fault, but that
I'm
was.
so tired of writing.
Oh my god, I was dying. I remember writing like 100 words and I was just like talking about us.
Someone like says to you,
It's 100 words of like
Yeah, I don't understand how people write that. I like look at that, I'm like, I don't know how anyone could write more than like 500 words. Like essays, like that. I'm like,
usually I do like 400.
I copy it and I put it to count how many words. I'm like,
Yeah, I like usually 400, but today I was just like, I was literally just like rambling about something.
and like someone told us that story.
so
about
hopefully.
I counted, I think we were like halfway through
exam,
them.
about the exam of quiz, and I was like,
Half is not fun.
I know.
Text saying.
It wasn't that bad, like,
Discussing the
At
comments.
least I never test them material.
honestly.
Yeah, wait, how?
No, we don't. So like, I
was
don't
gonna say,
have
what?
to test them. I'm glad to go.
I mean, I get it.
But today was
It's
just like,
honestly just like 5 people giving the same, like,
Yes.
Raw video of
You know, I've often been asked what I found most useful in my own training to become a diplomat. And without hesitation, I said, you know, I think the most useful courses I had were in Russian literature for the career that I had. And I'm very proud that, and it was very useful that when I finally got a PhD, it was not in international relations or political science, but Slavic language and literature. Professor Apollonio wants to tell us about some of the courses that we offer here.
Can I spend 2.5 hours doing it?
Yeah,
No,
that would be better than what they're going to hear.
No,
in the-
they will differ. They don't come here to listen to me. But I just basically, you know, you're going to start registering for classes, and I think a lot of people at Duke tend to think that the more they take in one narrow field, you know, the more useful they are, the more competitive they are. And I'm not, you have to take the courses that you need to take, but there are many other things that you can do that will sort of broaden you out. And of course, if you're interested in diplomacy, then learning about other cultures is important, and learning to read the literature of other cultures is important, and so on. So basically, I just made some flyers about a couple of the courses that I'll be teaching next semester in Russian literature and English. One is Dostoevsky, which I'm sure you guys have heard about. I know that Professor Malik knows Dostoevsky very well, and in fact has written about Dostoevsky, believe it or not, interestingly enough.
In fact, it was Dostoevsky that got me interested in Russian. When I first started reading as a freshman, I read Crime and Punishment, and from then on,
It was the end, it was all over.
right.
Well, if anyone here is a freshman, Brian Stevenson, who wrote the summer reading book, Just Mercy, about the death penalty and incarceration, told the first year class that the best book he ever read in college was The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. It's about law, it's about justice, it's incredibly compelling, it grabs you by your brain and your heart and changes your life. So I thought, well, he's a pretty good advocate for that too. But I don't want to take up your time. These are the courses, they're taught in English, and if you're an international student, I'm going to try something new with these classes. You can read in a different language if you want to, because they're written in Russian. So if you're, for example, a native speaker of Spanish, you can read in Spanish. I think it will make a really interesting class this time. I've never tried it, so that's one of the things we're going to
Will
do.
you let me sit in?
I would love to have you sit in, that would be so great. But I don't want to take up any more of your time. My office is 310. I'm often here in the evenings. You want to stop by. My email is on here, flath@duke.edu if you're curious about this, or our other courses in the department. Just let me know. Okay? Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
coming in, yeah. Well, I hope you had a restful and interesting fall break. I spent several days in Reykjavik, Iceland. The Icelandic Foreign Ministry and a peace organization in Vienna organized a conference on the 30th anniversary of the Gorbachev-Reagan summit meeting in Reykjavik, which occurred actually exactly 30 years before the last Tuesday, when we had that meeting. And since we've been studying that period, I thought I might give you just a brief readout on some of our discussions. Some of us talked about the summit itself. We had only a few people who had actually participated in it. On the American side, we had just actually one other participant than myself. On the Russian side, Pavel Palaschenko, who was Gorbachev's interpreter and has remained with Gorbachev as one of his principal assistants, came. By the way, being there with him, we had a very interesting sort of private dinner discussing the current relationship, which both of us are not happy with, shall we say. Now, I was asked to speak about the meeting itself, what it achieved and didn't achieve. And also, we were commenting on a statement that Mr. Edelman made. Edelman had written a book about the Reykjavik summit, and his subtitle was the 48 hours that ended the Cold War. So my first comment was, yes, the meeting was important. It was important, particularly in retrospect, when both Reagan and Gorbachev realized that the other was really trying to come to an agreement. And even though both had been very almost angry when it ended without an agreement to meet in Washington, as they thought through the issues, they realized that really a lot had been achieved. And so in their personal relationship, this was a turning point. But it was not the meeting that ended the Cold War. As I've mentioned here and several times before, I think that ended ideologically when Gorbachev, several years later, in December '88, gave a speech at the United Nations when he, in effect, rejected the Marxist-Leninist foundation of Soviet foreign policy and talked about a common European home and about the right of all countries to choose their political system and their destiny, which actually, of course, meant that there was no more Brezhnev doctrine on the Soviet side. But I pointed out that as far as statements were concerned, I thought that the crucial one in ending the Cold War was one, the agreement at Geneva in their first meeting, that was November '85, when they agreed that a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, and that means there can be no war between us. If you mean that sincerely, then, well, among other things, you don't do the sort of things both Russia and the United States are doing today in confronting each other implicitly militarily. And it was really that, on the basis of which, by both sides, step by step convincing the other that they were sincere about that, that enabled us to come to a whole series of agreements. Another lesson that I came that I expressed there was looking back, you know, half a loaf that was attainable was better than the whole loaf if it is elusive. In other words, another way is to say that don't let the best make the enemy of the good. And I meant by that essentially we had an agreement on what to do for the first 5 years. We were going to go to 0 INF, the intermediate range missiles in Europe, and cut all of our strategic forces by 50% with verification. Now, if we could have done that, it would have moved arms control much more rapidly. It was Gorbachev who held it up on his insistence that any testing of strategic defenses be done in laboratories and not outside, and Reagan's feeling that if he couldn't test outside laboratories, he couldn't get the program funded, because you can never know whether something will work without testing it. He was not asking for a right to deploy. Well, I won't go into that again, except that the point was that we could have moved arms control probably more rapidly if Gorbachev had not taken the position he did. The third thing I wanted to point out was the role of the unexpected. The fact that really the leaders cannot simply sit down and necessarily do a completely workable scenario. You can try to think through everything you can, but you can't repeal Murphy's Law. If something can go wrong, it will. In this case, something went wrong that had absolutely nothing to do with arms control or U.S.-Soviet relations. It was the Iran-Contra scandal, which weakened Reagan and led to the departure from the administration for most of the people who were working on these arms control solutions, and very much delayed the negotiations that went forward. And a fifth observation I made was that, thinking about that, and also the subsequent delays in strategic arms under the first Bush administration, I've been struck since then at the role of personalities and, you might say, ideological ownership of a concept. One of my first recommendations to President Bush when he was inaugurated was that we continue what we were doing in arms control as rapidly as possible for production of nuclear weapons, and add a few other things to the agenda. Many years later, when we were holding a conference on sort of a post-mortem on the end of the Cold War, there was a conference at Princeton, and there were representatives who were on Bush's NSC. And they said, well, you know, the problem with Matlock's proposals is that they look too much like Reagan's. We wanted something that looked different. Well, you know, and that's something I think we need to bear in mind in the real world. Even though they were the same political party, even though George Bush was Reagan's vice president, even though he had approved everything that Reagan had proposed for this. His people, and I have to presume he, wanted something that at least looked new. He didn't want to be responsible for carrying through something that people would give Ronald Reagan credit for. Well, maybe that's just being human, but it is something that often you don't consider if you look at international relations sort of as a matter of abstract concepts. And I finally concluded my presentation to say, right now, we need to return to that basic truth that Reagan and Gorbachev agreed before Reykjavik, which enabled everything else. That was a nuclear war cannot be won. It means there could be no war between us. Well, you know, I won't go into all the comments made, but I think one of the more interesting ones, when other experts who were not there at Reykjavik were looking at the situation today, and they pointed out, you know, whatever lessons there might be for arms reduction from this meeting and what came later, the current strategic situation is quite different. Maybe we should have been. We weren't worried about cyber warfare. We weren't worried about that. Terrorism was a problem, but it was more a police problem than a military problem. And as yet, it didn't loom that large. So, whatever lessons we try to draw from experiences of the past, we have to be cognizant of the fact that what we face today may be different in a number of respects, and though there may be lessons, they can't be applied mechanically and without consideration of the other things. Okay, anything about that you'd like to discuss? I know we have gone through all this before, but if there is, we can. If not, I'll go on to your questions on readings regarding the Gulf War. Let me see. See if I get the right ones here. I think. Okay. Jack Benju asked several questions that I thought were very interesting. And the question was why, as I understood it, why would Gorbachev approve U.S. troops in Europe and still be against Germany in NATO? I think to understand his position, you have to look at it in the context of a very rapidly changing situation. The thing is, first of all, just after the Berlin Wall came down, and at the time that Bush and Gorbachev met in Malta, there was there was a great uncertainty about what was going to happen in Germany, and none of us thought that unity was going to happen quickly. It was clear that they were trying to reform in East Germany, and it looked as if, though it might not last very long, that you could have an East German state with an open border and still existed, just as Austria firmly existed as a German language state, but separate from Germany, and with open borders. But it was events in Germany, in East Germany, that forced the issue. And as several of the readers implied, though most of them were talking about their own view of things, actually, they were, all of the leaders were driven by what happened in East Germany, by the rapid, almost continual demonstrations, and the feelings that the East Germans were going to insist upon unity, and were going to insist upon, in effect, doing it the way Kohl eventually proposed. That was not by negotiating between the government of the German Democratic Republic and the German Federal Republic, but simply by becoming part of the German Federal Republic. Now, I think that Gorbachev at first, when they came to a realization around January or early February of 1990, that the Germans were going to unify. And they, by March, they didn't have a loyal East German government that could have negotiated. Because their idea was, well, German unity is something for the future. It's for the 21st century, it's not for the 20th century. It's for our successors. And then, by the end of the year, they realized it's going to happen now. But then, if it's going to happen, Germany, a united Germany, has to leave NATO. That would make it too powerful in Europe. So, what in effect we were confronted with, and it was not the United States or the outsiders that were pushing the tempo, it was the Germans in East Germany that were pushing the issue. When Baker talked to Gorbachev in February, that's when he put the sentence to him. I'm sure I mentioned this before. He was trying to convince Gorbachev that it was in the interest of the Soviet Union to have a united Germany and NATO. Because when you think about it, it really was. So this wasn't pulling the wool over his eyes. But he started by saying, assuming there is no extension of NATO jurisdiction to the east, not 1 inch, wouldn't it be better if a united Germany is ensconced in NATO with all the limitations that puts on their military activity, because the German military forces were completely a part of NATO forces, and with an American military presence in Europe to balance them. Or to have a united Germany go totally independent without any restrictions on what future generations could do. In other words, they could go nuclear, they can again threaten us all. And Gorbachev's answer was, and he said, you don't have to answer me right now, but think about this. So he wasn't asking for an immediate deal. Some commentators have said, for example, well, Baker offered him a deal and he didn't take it, and therefore, well, no, that misrepresents what actually happened. He was saying, think about this. Isn't it really in your interest? And Gorbachev's answer was, well, certainly any expansion of NATO jurisdiction to the east is unacceptable. But regarding the other matters, I will give them careful thought, and I want you to know one thing: we are not trying to remove you from Europe militarily. That had been our policy for many years, but we now recognize that you can have a stabilizing influence. So maybe you don't need 300,000 troops to do with fewer, but we are no longer trying to expel you. So he had not really focused on the fact, and it was that the only legal basis we had for troops in Germany was NATO. And if NATO left, there would not be any American troops in Europe. I think he hadn't connected the two, but in that particular conversation, Baker came back and he did make that point. I'm not sure that Gorbachev ever seriously thought, well, you could have American troops in Europe and Germany out of NATO. He hadn't really thought it through at that point. Now, Jack also asked about the Polish view. The biggest Polish issue was to make very sure that Germany never again tries to claim any Western territory of Poland. After all, World War II had started over the German invasion of Poland. Germany at that time included places like Posen, Poznań, Breslau, Wrocław, Gdansk, which was a free city, and of course Germany had East Prussia, which has now been divided between Poland and Russia, or then the Soviet Union. So the main thing I think the Poles wanted out of it was an absolute guarantee the Germans would not raise these issues again. And we insisted that Kohl provide that. The Czechoslovaks, at that time they were still together, their main interest was having an absolute guarantee that Germany would not again claim the Sudetenland, the border areas that Hitler had taken. For Kohl, these were, I would say, somewhat of a political problem because he had constituents who had been expelled from these areas and were pressing, for it. But we told him in no uncertain terms, if we get a settlement here, you're going to have to absolutely clear by treaty, give up any claim to these territories, and they did. So in effect, we met the main Polish concern. And then also there was the question several of you raised about was Kohl's 10 points brinkmanship, and if so, wasn't it a dangerous brinkmanship? Well, I know this Hutchings calls it brinkmanship, and certainly I know that when those came out about the time that Gorbachev and Bush were meeting in Malta, and I don't think he had run them past us, so it was sort of by surprise. And I think both sides felt, well, he's sort of pushing the issue here. Certainly Gorbachev thought he was. This was at a time when Gorbachev thought that they could get a stable government in East Germany, which was a reform government, and that, okay, his successors sometime, 20, 30 years could look at German unity and try to work it out. It wasn't something he wanted to happen on his watch. But that was early December. I recall when I got back from the Malta meeting and a meeting of our ambassadors in Western Europe, I called on Shevardnadze. This must have been around the 7th or 8th of December in '89, and asked him. We were sort of reviewing what happened in Malta and the attitudes, and I said, how about Germany? And he said, well, we really think that the new government in East Germany is determined to keep its statehood, and we're quite comfortable with it. We think that everybody can live with open borders. Well, I think before the end of December, this was around the end of the first week in December, before the end of December they realized that wasn't going to be possible because of what was happening in East Germany. And of course, they had hoped that there would be enough of a government in East Germany that you could maybe negotiate some sort of confederation with, that would be still sort of a separate East Germany. But by March, early March, in free elections, the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, won the election in East Germany. So this was the same party that was the ruling party in West Germany. It's also the party that Chancellor Angela Merkel, of course, represents. So, in effect, there wasn't a pro-Soviet government in the GDR to negotiate with the West. What I'm saying is that, you know, and I think everybody in their comments noted how rapid this was, but all the time the facts on the ground were forcing these decisions. Sam Corolla asks about Soviet concern regarding Poland compared to Germany. This is an interesting question. Yeah, you know, when Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, first of all, began to throw out their communist leaders and elect usually social democrats to replace them, frankly, most Soviet citizens didn't pay much attention to that. They had their own problems. This was not a huge political traumatic issue, in part because they had been misled at times by their own propaganda to feel that all those East Europeans had their hands in their pockets, that they were given special privileges and so on, and they were better off without them. So it wasn't a matter of feeling that this is the fruits of our victory in World War II. After all, the Germans were the enemies. So I would say that I was in Moscow then, and people took that change in Eastern Europe very calmly, and in most cases, many of the intellectuals really approved of it, feeling that if they get democratic governments and we let that happen without force, they're going to be friends. This was the assumption. So there was not that much popular concern. I was struck then at how quickly and gracefully Gorbachev accepted the changes. I think within weeks, it may have even been days, of the Social Democratic Prime Minister being named in Poland, he was invited to Moscow. And then the Czechoslovaks sent the son of Rudolf Slansky, who had been killed on Stalin's orders, as ambassador to the Soviet Union. The agrément was accepted, he was accepted with grace. So, in a way, Gorbachev was accepting these and establishing perfectly normal, friendly relations with the replacement governments. And that's why when he began to press Germany, the East Germans, for more reforms, he became very popular in East Germany. In fact, in his visit there before the wall came down, when he was there visiting Honecker, there were crowds outside simply shouting, "Gorby, Gorby, Gorby." And this had a real effect on him. It's something he still recalls. I'm going to read later a portion that he's written in his most recent book about this period. Yeah, the Soviet concern over Germany was much deeper, much more emotional than the changes in Eastern Europe. Amy Wang asked, how was the Bush administration so sure that both West Germany and East Germany leaders would uphold their trust and promises? Well, actually, the East Germans And the West Germans had worked out the problems. It wasn't a matter of their promises to us. It was rather getting the outsiders off their back. But she also asked about the state of diplomatic relations with the GDR. Now this does raise an interesting question that, again, forgive me for getting into so much historical detail, but it is horrible. You know, when Germany was first divided, as I mentioned before, sure, there were 4 occupation zones. And Germany was frustrated. And the Western powers wanted to develop a unified currency and to be the basis of sort of putting the country back on its feet. There was widespread famine. We were feeding and the people there and elsewhere and so on, but Stalin refused. In fact, he was still moving equipment and stuff out of East Germany as reparations. So we started by unifying, you know, the 3 Western sectors, and eventually this became the Federal Republic of Germany, which was a federal republic with states. The federal constitution not that different from the United States. There's a good bit of local independence in the various units. And for a long time, after the Soviet Union responded by setting up the German Democratic Republic under its control, and then cutting it off from West Germany, for over a decade, there was the so-called Hallstein Doctrine. None of the Western countries recognized East Germany as an independent state. We still considered it legally territory under Soviet occupation. As a matter of fact, one of the issues in using the Autobahn in and out of Berlin is that we wouldn't recognize the East German border troops, only the Soviets as controllers. So we had many fights over those issues, and the West German government carried it on to third countries. Any country that recognized East Germany diplomatically, West Germany would break relations with them. Now, West Germany was much more important economically to most countries, so it really meant that for a long time there was the attempt simply to not to recognize East Germany as an independent state, still treat them as what was factually true. They were territory occupied by the Soviets. Now, Willy Brandt, the Social Democratic leader, who had been mayor in West Berlin, started a different policy, I believe in the 1970s, I have to check the exact date, early 1970s, called Ostpolitik, meaning East policy. And the idea was, okay, we'll recognize the government, we'll be in communication, and we will not block others' recognition. And so we had actually, in the mid-70s, recognized East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, and had established an embassy there. I recall visiting Berlin shortly after we established an embassy. We were still working to get the building in shape. And the person who had been our general services officer, was up in the house, who was responsible for maintenance and so on, had the job of putting our embassy in shape in East Berlin. Now the wall was still up, but when we recognized them, we could officially go back and forth using our passport, though the Germans couldn't. And I recall talking to the fellow who was trying to organize it, and he said, you know, these Germans have forgotten how to work. He said, I'm having real trouble. You know, the Germans have such a reputation of being very diligent and so on. He said, they've lost that. He said, if I only had my 2 Russian employees, he named 2 employees who had an embassy in Moscow, who did a lot of the maintenance. If I only had Chernov and Gaya, we could get things done. And I found this is very interesting, saying if we had only had a couple of Russians, they could do better than these East Germans. So the point is that really the system was one that had almost, I would say, destroyed the normal, what we think of, the German sense of hard work, of competence, and so on. But there being so few rewards on good work, I'm sure the attitude there, as it was in much of Eastern Europe, current in Poland, is, well, they pretend to pay us and we'll pretend to work. And that seemed to be the attitude. So the fact is that although we had tried to isolate East Germany and keep it as simply the Soviet occupation zone, by the mid-70s, we had officially recognized, and so had West Germany. We actually had diplomatic relations, so we considered them formally an independent sovereign country. And it was that question as to whether the East Germans, after the wall came down, would retain their sovereignty. And this was the one that in early December '89, the Soviets thought they would, at least for a few years. And by the end of December, they realized it wasn't going to happen. So these attitudes were changing all the time. Masha wrote a bit about socialism. I think that when we talk about terms like socialism and capitalism, let's make sure we know what we're talking about, because people use them as labels, either, often in criticism, sometimes in praise. I think the fact is that there is, and there probably has never been a totally capitalist country, one that is simply run by private capital, nor has there ever been, I think, the total socialism, how to define it. But there's one of the problems that we have is that the communist rulers in the Soviet Union, and then we call them puppets then, and this was probably appropriate in Eastern Europe, call their system socialism. It wasn't by any normal definition of socialism. It was in effect state monopoly capitalism on a non-market economy basis. In other words, prices were bureaucratically determined, and they were not responsive to the market, which caused an unofficial economy, a black market, to develop in many essential things. So one of the problems they had in the Soviet Union, which had had that system for 70 years, was that people, aside from those who ran the black market, in other words, the criminal, they were considered criminal elements then, they knew how the market worked. Most of the others didn't. And money as such in the macroeconomy just didn't play a role. Factories would be given quotas. During much of the Stalin period, and these quotas were so irrational, it's hard to believe. For example, in the machine tool industry, the quotas were given in terms of weight. So if you're making a machine tool, you'd make it as heavy as possible, because you would be judged by doing so many thousand tons of machine tools. And so on. And if you said you produced it, if you were producing it for the civilian economy, whoever was supposed to receive it had to accept it. In the military sector, however, you didn't get credit for producing it until the military accepted it. So the only place they had decent quality controls was in the military. And none of this was described in terms of money. It was described in terms of physical units. Well, I mean, this is so different from a market economy. Now, the thing about the East Europeans was that they had this system a much shorter period. They hadn't totally lost any sense of what the market economy is about. But I think to get really to Masha's question is, what was, as I understood it, what was Gorbachev's sense of socialism? And Gorbachev modified his views during the years he was in power. I think by 1990 and 91, he was clearly a democratic socialist. He has said in his writings since then, the socialism he thinks we should aspire to is that of the Scandinavian countries. He very much admires Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, saying they have the sort of society that he definitely became a democratic socialist and looked at the command economy as a big mistake. Now, in the case of Gorbachev, I don't think he himself fully understood capitalist economies. I think he remained basically democratic in the sense that he wanted elections, he wanted them to be free, but he did want a pretty thorough social safety net. He wanted free education. He wanted free medical care. He wanted those things. Yes, and you could call it democratic socialism, but it wasn't what they call socialism in the Soviet Union. There she is. She asked, could this have happened in the 1970s? Very good question. No. Why? You had a different Soviet leadership. I mean, they were just barely getting reconciled to the fact that we were going to hang on to East Berlin. This was still the government that had put down revolts. They had put down revolts in Hungary. They had put down in Czechoslovakia an attempt to create socialism with a human face, which wasn't even a military revolt, as it had been in Hungary. They had put down attempts in Poland, and as late as 1981, they in effect forced the Poles to declare martial law in response to solidarity. So they were not even until Gorbachev willing to consider changes in Eastern Europe, much less Germany. So it wasn't, and there had been revolts, particularly in East Berlin, which were simply put down militarily. I mean, there had been demonstrations, when I say revolts. So, so East Germany had become so cut off, except that in East Berlin they could get television from West Germany. You know, after unification, I visited Germany a number of times, and I've talked to people who lived in East Germany, and I would ask them, well, you know, how did you cope with this at the time? And they said, you know, we just put it out of our mind. That was foreign territory, inaccessible, you just lived your life without it. But they were very much aware that life outside was better than what they had, and so on. Now, I think Isabel Shaviola had some interesting questions. Let me see, I don't want to misquote her. Here we are. The second aspect of Gorbachev's memoir that irked me was his hopeful and borderline humanitarian view of the German people. His account to me read like an unfortunate reality of the poor, upstanding German citizens. And yet Gorbachev, though he maintained firm that the USSR would no longer interfere with German domestic politics, did not touch upon the dominating rule the USSR had on East Germany until that point. And later she says that his account made it seem like the Soviet Union was making a moral and ethical decision to not interfere with the politics of East Germany, while the argument can be made that the ethical thing would be to actively work on adjusting the standards of living for East Germans to that of West Germans. Could that have been done with the system they had? You know, subsequently, the West put billions of Deutsche Marks into East Germany. They still don't have it up to that standard. As I said, the problem was the system. And the standard in East Germany was higher than in the Soviet Union, after all. So that could hardly be. But I think the feeling that somehow there was something insincere here, I think is probably unfair. And I brought here a book which has just been published. It's his most recent one, Gorbachev, called The New Russia. And it's mainly about his views of what's happened since then, but he thinks back. And I did want to read you at least some excerpts of what he talks now about German unity, because some of the others also ask, how do you put it now? By the way, I would say that I was in Berlin last year for the 25th anniversary of German unity. Gorbachev came, he is lionized by the Germans. They give him credit, but they give him a lot of credit. And we had fireworks at the Brandenburg Gate, huge people, huge gatherings of people coming up and celebrating. And I think there was like a $2,000 plate dinner the Germans came to honor Gorbachev. Anyway, here's what he said in his latest book, which was written in the last year or so. Europe, he's quoting, Europe, Germany, and Russia between the past and the future. This was the title I gave to my speech in Frankfurt on Main at the celebration of the 20th anniversary of German unification. The first thing I said after congratulating the Germans on this occasion was, you have done yourself proud. The commitments that you, the German nation, undertook, you have successfully fulfilled. You're an example to all countries following the path of democracy or seeking it. For all that to come about, much had to change in the world, with huge changes in Soviet society and among the peoples of the Soviet Union. At the same time, there had to be changes in international relations, the end of the Cold War, and changes in the two German states. For us, the leaders of that generation, George Bush, Margaret Thatcher, François Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl, Germany presented a major challenge. For many years, it had been an acute European and global problem, a bare nerve in international politics. I recall the milestones along the way that led to the historic threshold crossed when Konrad Adenauer visited Moscow in the mid-1950s and the establishment of diplomatic relations between the USSR and West Germany. The Eastern policy of Willy Brandt, I've just spoken about that, and Andy Brezhnev's meetings with Helmut Schmidt. I spoke of the role of the German Democratic Republic in overcoming the hatred of Germany left by the war in the hearts of many Soviet people, especially those who had fought in the war. As late as June 1989, Helmut Kohl and I were agreeing that the unification of Germany would be a matter for the 21st century. This is June '89. I recall But within a few months, in November, the Berlin Wall came down. It's not that we were mediocre prophets. No, the people expressed their will loudly and clearly. The citizens of the GDR took to the streets to demand reunification without delay. They had the support of the entire population of West Germany. "We are one people" was the slogan of the hour. This was particularly evident during a torchlight procession on the occasion of the German Democratic Republic's 40th anniversary. Representatives of all the regions of the GDR came together in Berlin. Together with the country's leaders and other guests, I was standing on the podium. He bowed a potion, but he says, I was standing next to Wojciech Jaruzelski and Polish Prime Minister Mieczysław Rakowski. Mieczysław turned to me and said, "You do know this is the end." I replied, "Yes, I understand what is happening." No one can ignore such determination on the part of the people, and we recognized it. If we had embarked on democratic change to give people freedom in our own country, we could not refuse it to citizens of other countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and could not deny the German people the right to unification. He goes on, and then he also makes some comments about the other Western leaders in this respect. And he speaks of his own participation in the Petersburg Dialogue, which is was a periodic meeting in St. Petersburg between Germany and Russian leaders. And he also ends with a compliment of Chancellor Merkel. Chancellor Angela Merkel plays an important role in the development of Russo-German relations. We've met on many occasions and discussed meaningfully and frankly the ties between our countries and civil society in Russia and Germany. Angela has told me about her life growing up and developing as a person and future politician in East Germany. Today she is a strong, visionary politician, not only in Germany but also in Europe, and seems to me an ideal example of the role of the human factor in politics. No, I think Gorbachev was quite sincere, and I think what lay behind this was the feeling, whether at home or abroad, you don't solve problems by using force. He really believed that, believe it or not. And I think we're all in his debt in that respect. Let me see. George Daly asked, did Gorbachev view a united Germany as a threat? No, I don't think he did. The problem was not that it was a threat, but that if East Germany disappeared, the Soviets would feel that, well, their victory in World War II, where they had suffered so much, was now being, in effect, thrown away. Because the most tangible symbol and reality for Soviets regarding World War II was the fact that Germany was divided, that East Germany was friendly to them, that if the West was going to be hostile, they had a band of friendly countries to keep the hostile nations off their border. After all, Russia had been invaded several times in its history, and they haven't forgotten it. This is something that, you see, our reaction to 9/11, when bad as it was, nearly 3,000 people lost their lives, 2 buildings in New York and part of the Pentagon. The Soviets had most of European Russia occupied at one point and almost totally destroyed. They had been invaded by the French the year before. They had been, large areas had been occupied in the map in World War I. So every few decades they had been invaded by foreign forces. It's an entirely different historical experience. than that we have had. We had a civil war, but that was not a foreign invasion. And even the War of 1812 was not much of an invasion. They burned Washington, the few buildings that were there then, but not much else. So it's been a long time since the United States has had, in effect, a war by foreigners on our own soil. There was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, southern attack, but not an occupation. And when we see how we reacted to 9/11, which was a terrorist act, not an occupation, you can see how maybe others have a reason to be more antsy than we are on some of these questions. But I don't think he considered Germany a threat, and of course the whole argument that Baker put to him, that I repeated earlier, was let's think of the future, let's make sure Germany, when it unites, because it's going to unite, will not be a threat, and the best guarantee of that is keeping it in NATO. And you know what? That was true, yes.
So one of the arguments that Baker made was that Germany would see, Soviet Union would see economic benefits from increased trade with Germany. Did that actually happen? And if it did, how long did it take?
That was not a Baker argument, but it was certainly one that Kohl made and Genscher. It was not for us to talk about the trade with Germany. The Germans certainly did.
Okay.
Oh, he got major benefits. Large loans, large grants. The Germans paid, for example, to build housing for the Soviet troops that were stationed in Germany and were removed from East Germany. He got loans and grants of, I would have to check the numbers, but probably around 20 billion Deutsche Marks or more. And of course, the feeling at the time among some Russians that Gorbachev might have held out for even more. But I think our attitude was that, well, sure, the Germans should pay a certain price, and it was up to them. In fact, they did. And yes, trade, still, even with Western sanctions, their trade with Germany is probably the largest of any country. The amount of investment Germans have made since the end has been quite substantial. And of course, you have now the pipeline that comes directly from Russia under the Baltic to Germany for the natural gas and other things. Yes, I think as outside investors, the Germans have been probably the most money. So yes, and this has been true on both sides. By the way, there is very substantial opposition in Germany to the current sanctions on Russia because they hit them. We don't have that much trade, so it doesn't hit us much, but it does hit the Europeans. Obviously, relations were much better before the whole Ukrainian crisis, which obviously has involved Germany, but we can talk about that later when we get to it. Yes, let's see. Connor also asked about the relationship with Russia today. Well, obviously it's strained because of Ukraine and the actions there, but it has not reached anything like the vituperative stage it has with the United States, because Merkel has not gone into the personal criticism of Putin that Obama has, or Clinton for that matter. And potentially, except for the things formally under the sanctions, there's still quite a bit of trade with Germany. Germany is a major partner. And you know, this is something they understood all along. As early as March '90, I had senior Soviets telling me that, well, other countries want us to block German unity, meaning France and Britain. We're not going to do it. because we cannot, for the future, make ourselves the enemy of German unity. That simply Germany is too important to us. And this was when it was the Soviet Union. It's even more so now that Russia is a more restricted concept. Katie Fishka asked about how worried were the French and the British. I don't think either Mitterrand or Thatcher were that worried. They would have preferred that it not happen then. Once they saw, I think by January, February of '90, that it was going to happen, they really didn't put any spokes in the wheel. In fact, as I said, they were not enthusiastic, but I think the view Gorbachev's view was, well, we've suffered even more than they have, and yet for the future we must make up. And it's artificial to keep the Germans divided if they want to unify. That's simply not democratic, and it's not viable for the future. I think he was right. Katie also asked about the difference between 2+4 and 4+2. I think Emma Rose explained that very well in her comment. 2+4 meant that the Germans will decide how they want to unite. And then the four occupation powers will decide whether this fits a stable Europe for the future in terms of giving them up. So, and it kept it from being the case of the four external powers saying, okay, this is the way the Germans are going to do it. That was not going to work. So, so it really means that putting the Germans first, but legally and in many respects, they were on the hook to get the approval of others. People sometimes forget now that the Soviets had, I think, nearly 300,000 troops stationed in East Germany, and they were not legally required to take them out. And if the Germans had decided, well, we're going to unite anyway, you know, Gorbachev said, okay, go ahead, but my troops stay there. Well, think of the problems that would have been for the future if there were incidents or whatnot. So actually, to legalize it all, one needed a settlement of all these various issues that I've mentioned. The borders, you know, going back to Poland, for example. After World War II, Poland had been physically moved in the most literal sense to the west. What is now western and part of northern Poland was all Germany. And what is now part of Belarus and western Ukraine was Poland. So one of the things that happened at the end of World War II, Poland was moved to the west, the Germans were moved out of those areas, Poles came in, and Poles were allowed to leave the areas which are now in Ukraine and Belarus, and to populate the areas that the Germans were moved out of. Nobody wanted to go through all of that again. So one of the things the settlement did was to fix those borders. No more, you know, moving them around. So Poland had lost territory in the east, but it gained it in the west at the expense of the Germans. That they lost in the east are basically the people in western Ukraine today, in southern Belarus, who were not very happy under Polish rule. In fact, Ukrainian nationalism began to develop because the Poles were as almost insistent on Polonizing the country linguistically as the Russians had been on Russifying. But that's another question. And Horace also asked about the political brinkmanship. I think I mentioned that before. Yeah, it was, I'm not sure that brinkmanship, I would necessarily use the term that Hunter used, but certainly it was pushing the envelope at the time. But it happened that it was precisely the sort of thing that would have stimulated the East Germans to do what they did. And when you followed up that 10 points with an offer to convert the East German mark on a par with the West German mark, when it was probably worth something like a twelfth as much. This was extraordinarily generous and very costly to the West, but sort of irresistible, I think, for those in the East. I think Liam has some comment about terms being decided on by Bush. I think that's putting it not quite the way I would see it. Actually, the terms, the basic terms of unity, as I've been describing, were decided by the Germans. The main thing we wanted was, if they were going to unify, we wanted to stay in NATO. And we thought that was important. And I think it was. So the main thing was to convince Gorbachev that this was in his interest, in the interest of the Soviet Union. And I would argue that, in fact, it was. We were not fooling him in that respect. So this was a case where you had to stop looking at the world as if it was a geopolitical zero-sum game. You had to sort of look at how can you create a future that is more stable, that will not have the conflicts that have wrecked Europe in the past, and that's what we were trying to do then. Now, we've been criticized since then, and I was at a conference in the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Berlin last year. There were several celebrations of the 25th anniversary of German unity, and one of the European participants took us to task, those of us who were doing the diplomacy in those days, for not creating a stable European order. I think that was quite unfair, because at the time of German unity, when we were making those agreements, which I think were reasonable for Germany and for everybody else, the governments were changing in Eastern Europe. They were changing very rapidly. In some cases, it was only even later when they changed in Romania and Bulgaria. And you didn't have, at that point, stable governments. You got together, you couldn't or shouldn't try to impose on Eastern Europe, a new European order, shouldn't they be sure on it? You couldn't do it then. I would say that if the goal of creating a Europe whole and free could not have been reached, actually, during the Bush administration, it had to be done in the 90s. And that was what was not done by the Clinton administration in this respect. In fact, with the start toward the end of the 90s of expanding NATO and whatnot, they made virtually impossible the creation of the sort of stable European order that we had envisaged at the time of German unity. But that's a story for later. Yes, Alex Kelly asked if there's any connection with the collapse of the Soviet Union. I don't think there was. This was a traumatic thing for the Russians, but at the same time, I think what brought the Soviet Union down were entirely internal pressures. We're going to be talking about that in a couple of weeks when we look at Boris Yeltsin and the breakup of the Soviet Union. I think that the Soviet Union, that the loss of Eastern Europe might even have, I would say, make the Soviet Union more viable in a sense. But in any case, I don't think there was a connection there. By the way, one of the questions that came up at our conference on the Reykjavik summit was the allegation that some have made in the United States that SDI brought about or helped cause the breakup of the Soviet Union. The idea being that SDI caused them to put resources into trying to keep up with us that helped break the economic back. That idea was put forward by one of the Americans there. Every single one of the Russians there said it was nonsense. It really had nothing to do with it, and I had to agree with it. I too thought it was nonsense. But so I think to break up the Soviet Union, we need to look at entirely in terms of what happened within the Soviet Union. I think that's just about it. Any more questions you'd like to be about Germany? Because we'll be talking about the Gulf War after the break. So, German unity. I think you all got it very clearly. Unexpected, driven by the Germans. Pretty impressive American diplomacy. In fact, I think it'll go down as a classic of the way diplomacy should work. Let's take our break and we'll be back around 8 o'clock. I don't have comments on all of them, but maybe one.
Find a fish eating bread.
The what? Command your joint special operations command.
No, I do this literally. You're like, I do this so often. It's just
These days I'll just stop on because
Did you decide to take a course?
well, it's half it due and half it UNC. And like I've been an econ minor, so I need to get one. And it's 2 pages. Really? This is huge. I'm ready. That's it. Do you know Sebastian that year is?
I know him through really funny things.
I think he is, he's interested in like kind of that type of thing too.
He went to high school with my ex,
Oh, really?
and he also dating
I don't know.
They're like, they're always
I
very
thought they were
secretive.
such a cute couple. but I-
They're always very secretive, so I think I was in front of him and I was dating.
What prompted this interest?
It's just like really similar to the history stuff I do. You know. And I was just like, if I take a different strategy with this than like just tech, because like I'm not really like a tech person. Like I want to keep my like football stuff, and like my residential sciences, environmental stuff, and then like community building stuff, and like ways hammered with anyone really involved in all of this.
So do you want to be from the government side or from like consulting side? Or?
So the firm that does like government contracting, as well as like
Good for
I
you,
have identified
Kaylee.
firms.
Just got the degree.
Yeah, but I don't think I can get any jobs in that, so it's fine.
No. Let's say that. Don't write someone off.
They all require a master's. You have to go get a master's.
I think it's too late to start applying for that.
No, it's not. I'm about to go to January.
You're just gonna take a
The
GRE.
GRE.
I heard that's not.
That's what people have told me. They said it's pretty easy. It's like very different apparently. It's like not as tricky as anything else that is.
Did you give me like urban planning courses?
So stupid. I mean, I basically like created like that program representation for myself, right? 'Cause like I've done public policy. I've done so much stuff like with Durham. I like know GIS, which is like one of the most important skills for it. And like I've done all this like EOS and like environment stuff. So I'm in a historic architecture class right now. Like here I come, really.
It's pretty convenient for you. It's a good thing you picked this out.
No, I just feel like I don't feel like it's like that I picked it. I feel like it's that like everything in my life is like converging.
It's fake.
I might have just figured it out.
Now you're ready to go.
But I think I want to do like architecture grad school. Or do this kind of thing.
This is a good time to go into that too. So much of the U.S.'s infrastructure needs to get moving.
And international too. I would love to work in project as international stuff as well. You know, I just love city government. Just there's so much.
You love city governments?
I do. I think the most effective local government.
It never works together at the city level. Like it's no huge parts.
Well, and they actually find themselves as working for their citizens. And like do something very good.
City governments are like really state officials. Because they're like so,
No, I'm with you. They're
They're
not,
so
they're not
slimy.
inspired. They're just,
they're so fake. They just show up at things, shake hands.
they're on like the rung of the ladder. They're trying to keep up, but they're like,
But also like incompetent. So they think they're fun. Rabbit. Yeah.
oh yeah.
I'm
We're
going
going in. When is that? What day
It's
of the week is
next
that?
Friday.
Friday?
To the TV.
Wait, let's get a crew.
Let's do it. Dom, do you
Okay, do you
know
wanna
Dom?
come? What is this? Oh, thank God, Dom's coming.
Dom's going.
Dom's my hero.
I don't know how to describe it. Is it rabbits? It's giant rabbits. Here.
It's a giant field filled with rabbits.
Okay.
And in addition to being an art exhibit, it's also an EDM festival in the fields.
I mean, sure, I'm confused, but I'll go.
That's okay, you're supposed to be confused, it's fine.
Let's see. What's it called?
I can't remember, go on my.
It's probably in my friends.
Yeah, did you subscribe? Or
Yeah, I did.
I'll probably find it. Is it tomorrow?
It's tomorrow.
Tristan, I like really can't go. Is there a better machine down there?
I can't- I was
It's just
going
like
to.
the bathroom that's like downstairs, but it's like a mess. I went to the
It was
one in the
trash,
basement.
yeah.
I went to the one in the
I might
basement.
I don't know, I went in there and someone had like torn down all the toilet paper.
Yeah,
and
and
like
it's
thrown
like
all
all
over
over
the
the
ground.
ground.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's like one bathroom in this place, we place like.
There's
clean
one next
bathrooms.
door.
Well, there's one in the basement, which is the one I just ran to.
I need to have a nice one.
Yeah. It's like very scary and very dark. I'm glad I survived.
I feel bad, but I'm so tired. I have 2 midterms the next 2 days. And I'm just like,
Good
it's
luck.
Sugar Society.
And you have the
Sorry.
interview.
Oh God.
How much do you much do you want this job? How much do you want this
Oh, I
job?
would love to have this job. It's just like I'm not good at. I try not to get my hopes up because you get rejected. Like I feel like you just learn to get rejected from so many things in your job.
Sure, sure.
We never talked about the 30.
What?
And then like one response
you went
back,
to
you're lucky.
Oh, yeah, which is classes.
You
I
went
feel
to
that.
snails, I saw this now.
I don't really know.
I'll be okay.
I like going to
You
these
do
things.
snails, everything's fine.
I
was
was
looking
giving
at
up. I'm at the point where I'm like, no, like, this is how much I'm gonna have to study.
So right after.
Plus also like you're getting here right from school and so like no matter what, like this is your last line for around 20
I understood some.
Yeah, to become a college degree does that.
Wait, what is it?
He's like the probably most famous like Russian writer.
When she was like everyone heard of it, it was just like I have it.
Sorry.
Like my high school. Well, it didn't suck. It's actually pretty good, but we didn't talk.
Did it in AP Lit.
Oh yeah.
Like,
Wait,
do all
what?
the foreign, like different types of writers.
Yeah. Wait. What?
I don't know. I didn't read
Just
it.
forgot.
I didn't read it.
Yeah.
I don't remember. I mean, totally honest.
So I thought he literally was like, where?
He also still hasn't called me before.
Yeah. I waited for him to call and be like, hey, what's up?
Did you guys have to go on a field trip?
I purposefully write things that are not controversial, but don't ask any questions because I don't want to be talking to the class.
Like a whole weekend.
No, she was not induced. I don't know.
Why not?
Well, I wasn't used to start out with.
Yeah, but then it ended up becoming. I gotta work for myself.
Maybe it's not here. There's someone else that's Yeah.
I love.
Yeah, sure.
I really hope it looks just like
Yeah. It's the easiest way to know if you're called one. You message yours.
Yeah, I'm on the older side.
I thought like the thing I was gonna use for my op-ed was wrong, like such a word for people. It was only 3 words, but it was also
Number third is classroom or it's book bag?
basically writing a book right.
Yeah, I'm supposed to write 800 to 1,000 words. I have like 450 words. Every year they change they like bump up the requirements for a column So when I started sophomore year, it was 650 words as the minimum, 650 to 850. And now it's 800 to 1,000.
I thought about writing for the comic book and I was like, no, I hate
Also, like
It's not kind of
1,000.
the ideal. Yeah.
1,000 words. Like, no one
No,
wants
it's
to
not.
read 1,000
Yeah,
words.
they like made us like put us.
Absurd amount. Like
Yeah, they
people
linked
aren't
us
even
to,
the
like-
attention span of, like 460
Yeah,
words.
literally, they linked us to a thing that was there was this is what you write your op-ed and it's like do not exceed 7 sentences. Like no one's gonna read it.
Like what? High school doing like.
But almost all my columns are under like at least
$2.
Here.
Maybe I should
Yeah, I
buy
write
myself
columns.
But like,
That's so cool.
Generally, conversation.
Wait, how much are they?
I don't talk about national issues. I don't really make any ads.
yeah, so someone else said it better, yeah. Someone spent 2 days reading it, said it better. I like linked them my op-ed, I was like, someone smart than me, I just have an article right here that you can read.
There we go.
I'm just gonna put the link here.
Yeah, feel free to read it.
I'll let you know tonight.
Yeah,
I was looking today, there's like at least 10 kids
well, someone doing that.
I checked in the syllabus.
Yeah, you do
and
exactly.
It's technically, I think, like
It's
10%
yeah,
every day or something.
So I was like
It's
confused.
I
I meant to ask
her
her
to
like,
like, so she town, like,
somehow like She didn't come today, so.
She only shows up at the beginning, like drops off the stuff, and we use the whole thing. We got the camera right here.
It's the champagne bottle.
Oh, yeah.
Everything you say, and we use these guys.
Whatever. They're like super hard.
Have you started your
And the water bottle exploded while it was hitting over.
I feel like I should. Did you read that
Dude, I just.
he'll like give you edits and stuff if you turn it in?
It was really nice. Just for like a no, but I think I'm wrong with that.
Yeah. And I'm gonna try to do that, especially since there only used to be 12 pages, you know, like lower.
Oh, I can love this now.
Like 12 pages is something I could write and like,
You know, like.
so I think it's gonna take 1 week and just
We gotta watch West.
do it.
This is like mochi.
I originally wanted to go to that, but teacher was like, why don't you read like why you're supposed to do
All that economics stuff is so complicated.
There's reasons like why it failed and like why it wasn't. There's nothing like why it was. Wait, is it also like
Yeah, which just means that so like your message.
Oh, no, yeah, right, yeah, everybody else is
I like to talk to every other person to see how long they are, but it never marks it.
Yeah, it doesn't unless you like dump your phone.
I don't need people to know that.
Yeah, you don't want to do it because like.
Like whoever does there's like the night before, I see how many words they all have.
Yeah, I also wonder, I'm like, so what's it about? Like,
I don't even
I'm
know.
really gonna use like one hundred better.
They're 4 hours a day.
It's like one of the most common
The only way it would be like possible is if you like and stuff.
And I keep saying I'm gonna fix it.
well, I went to math class and he was like, well, it's like potentially fine. And you're like, that's not gonna be.
Like you're gonna read all his memoirs and memoirs.
And it's pretty nuts. And then I was just like, the cereal and right through the background. So I think I'm gonna just switch it to the opening of or like
Yeah, my topic, I don't know much about. So I already like done research on it for another class. I feel like I had like at least
I did that last year. I had I won't copy it, so I'm just gonna read it.
I tried to, so I'm just going to work at but that doesn't go up past like the 7. So I wanted to like write out. Poker is the worst problem.
Like you don't get into the regular?
No, it's we talked about like the red scare and stuff like that. I don't know much. It's honestly, yeah, it's something that's through like the case
I'm like not in
like civil rights and red scare. Apparently everything that was liberal was just communist. I went to the Youth Smithsonian Museum where I was there too.
Wait, so my grandma's which president? Or not in it, but like, did you go to I know very well. There's like a slave house and it's like they did it for different like grandma's own house.
Yeah, isn't that, there's like one, so there's a house on the bottom of it.
Yeah, it's a bottom, yeah, it's that one. They like, and they took it from like, she lived there for or something, and they took it from there and
I would take a picture.
I know, I wanna go, I'm like planning to write something to like, to the White House, like, hey, there's a lady up and like, her house is like, you guys just like,
Yeah,
they did it for like one, like he's like represented in some other ways, so like things like people like ask her, like how she got this so higher, you should apply. She's like she's very like doesn't want to be in Westboro, like what I would think about her. Like I don't know, I'm sure if it's like so you want to go over and she's like
old people say.
Yeah, she like the hurricane that just happened, we were like, you need to leave. Like, you're near Charleston. And she was like, no. It's not time to go.
Duke the North, don't get it.
Yeah, so there was like a video, and they were protesters holding signs with like race mixing. Like they literally just like associate anyone they didn't like.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know the civil rights and Cold War are like related to each other.
Yeah, they would just associate like the like people that were like graduating and associate anything to do with like
You're like, I don't buy it.
so like therefore it's bad. It's like race mixing is bad. Deeds rights are bad. Anything that wasn't Christian is bad.
Oh, wait, I do remember learning something about that. They both actually.
Yeah.
Be like very like weird news and with Americans and also just called it where you were like teenage girls talking about curses.
Does it coincide with Mosul?
I can't imagine like being scared like I think I should watch this. So it's a bus like that's something like
Maybe it's some work where it gets back.
How did you find it?
I saw you think I said that earlier. I saw we got the same answer. I love how trash are you?
Yeah, I don't get it.
Oh,
You know,
But like, once we go to church, I feel a lot,
Oh, I didn't shot it. You guys.
Zelda.
Of course.
Actually, just a few weeks before we signed the final 2+4 agreement on Germany, even though most of the issues had by then been negotiated, in the summer of 1990, a new crisis burst upon us. And it happened that Baker and Shevardnadze were meeting near Irkutsk, not far from Lake Baikal, off in Siberia, in one of the most scenic areas of that part of the Soviet Union. On the last day of the meeting, just before they both left, we had news that Iraqi troops had crossed the border of Kuwait. At that point, we didn't know whether this was just a minor border skirmish or whether there was real intent to occupy Kuwait. Now, this side of the U.S.-Soviet negotiations, I've described in one of my earlier books when the memories were much closer. Maybe I'll do better rather than trying to recall them now, simply reading what I wrote about this. During the first meeting, that is of Baker and Shevardnadze in the morning of August 1st, we received disturbing news. The report came in that Iraqi troops had crossed the border of Kuwait. Initially, it was not clear whether this was a minor intrusion or a full-scale invasion, and the meeting broke up before there was time to discuss the report in detail. Baker left for a planned visit to Mongolia, and Rebecca and I, with some of Baker's party, returned to Moscow with Shevardnadze. Our relationship had developed to that point that we were traveling on each other's planes and so on, and it was all very congenial. When we arrived in Moscow, the news was that Iraq had occupied Kuwait and announced its annexation. Two of Baker's closest aides, Dennis Ross, the head of the State Department's Policy Planning Council, and Baker's expert in the Middle East, and Robert Zellick, the counselor of the State Department who had worked on German questions and economic issues, were with us in Moscow. They also came with the Shevardnadze. It was obvious that Baker would have to return to Washington immediately and not continue on his planned fishing trip into the Mongolian interior. The question, however, was whether he should travel by way of Moscow in the hope of obtaining Shevardnadze's agreement for joint action in the UN Security Council, or by way of Beijing or Tokyo. Mongolia was about equidistant from Washington by either route. If there was any hope of getting Soviet agreement to joint action in the Security Council, stopping in Moscow would be worth it. Until then, Iraq had been a Soviet ally, the recipient of massive supplies of military equipment. Thousands of Soviet military advisors and trainers lived there. Though we knew that the Soviet government was not behind the invasion of Kuwait, we understood that it would be difficult for it to act in concert with us to end the aggression, since this would mean making an about-face in its entire Middle East policy and perhaps placing a number of its citizens in danger. Nevertheless, the stakes were high, and we decided we should make every effort to persuade Gorbachev and Shevardnadze to join us in resisting Iraq's aggression. If new thinking and the common interests of mankind meant anything, it should mean the Soviet Union would condemn the aggression and join us in bringing pressure on Iraq to withdraw. The first Soviet reaction was encouraging. On August 2nd, the Foreign Ministry issued a statement calling for, quote, swift and unconditional withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait, supported by a UN Security Council resolution with the same appeal, and called in the Iraqi ambassador in Moscow to deliver the same message officially. This was a welcome change from the past, but it did not necessarily mean that Moscow would be willing to work in concert with the United States to force Iraq out of Kuwait. Ross discussed the question with Sergei Tarasenko, his counterpart in the Soviet Foreign Ministry. Tarasenko reported that although Shevardnadze had not made up his mind and was being pushed by his Middle East experts to refuse joint action with the United States, Baker could probably convince him to go along if he talked to him personally. It was not the absolute assurance we would like to have, but Baker decided to act on it and instructed his pilots to head west out of Ulaanbaatar rather than east. Baker and Shevardnadze met for several hours at the terminal at Moscow's Vnukovo 2 airport, which was never used for commercial traffic, but only for arriving and departing foreign chiefs of state and top Soviet officials. Tarasenko's advice proved accurate. The two agreed on a statement that was a precursor of a series of joint votes in the UN Security Council. Finally, it seemed possible for the United Nations to operate it as it had originally been designed to do. Talk of a new world order began to supplant the competitive rhetoric of the Cold War. August 1990 did not provide the usual vacation time for many statesmen and diplomats. As Iraq's grip on Kuwait tightened and reports of atrocities mounted, President Bush began to organize a multilateral effort to apply military pressure. Shevardnadze's agreement with Baker was encouraging, but Bush had to be sure of Gorbachev's continued support if he was to be successful in building a coalition on the basis of Security Council resolutions. To solidify his support, he proposed a meeting in Helsinki, which Gorbachev immediately accepted. The two met for most of the day on Sunday, September 9th, and the Persian Gulf crisis dominated the talks. Gorbachev wanted assurance on 2 points: that military pressure would be used to induce Saddam Hussein to abandon Kuwait without a fight, and that U.S. forces would be withdrawn from the area when Kuwait was free. Bush pledged to make every effort to dislodge the Iraqi grip on Kuwait without war, but avoided making any assurance that force would not be used if Saddam Hussein continued his intransigence. As for U.S. forces in the area, he promised they would be cut back to normal levels after Kuwait had been liberated. For many years, the United States have maintained some naval forces in the Gulf, and Gorbachev did not press for a complete withdrawal, only for the departure of those forces sent to the area specifically to deal with the Iraqi invasion. There was also extensive discussion of the Soviet economy and the need for external support. Bush pledged continued support for Perestroika, but avoided any commitment to large-scale financial assistance. Instead, he offered verbal support and promised efforts to eliminate Cold War barriers to trade, provision of some humanitarian aid and technical assistance, and encouragement to private investors. Neither spoke of the two topics as being in any way related, but it must have been clear without discussion that American willingness to be supportive of reform in the Soviet Union might not survive Soviet opposition to Western policy in the Gulf. While Gorbachev was determined to avoid a US-led war in the region if he could, he must have realized that if he could not force Iraq to back down without war, he would not be able to block a US-led invasion. What he needed was at least a few months to try to find a political solution. This George Bush was willing to grant, particularly since preparations for successful military action would take some time. The understandings reached in Helsinki held, though not without periodic tensions and occasional misunderstandings. Following on the unification of Germany, the US-Soviet political cooperation during the Gulf crisis convinced many that a breathtaking new partnership of erstwhile rivals was in the making. In addition, the two statesmen's frequent contact over the months ahead that these understandings engendered, both direct by telephone and indirect by correspondence through representatives, created a remarkably strong personal bond between them. Well, that gives something of how the relationship began, I would say, to develop regarding what became the Gulf War. There were quite a few ins and outs, and particularly on the Soviet side, there was opposition in the Soviet Foreign Ministry to the criticism of Iraq. After all, as I mentioned in that passage, the Soviet Union, Iraq had been sort of a client state militarily of the Soviet Union. They had supplied most of its military equipment. They had military advisors, trainers, and families there, several thousand people. So it was a tough one for them. But Shevardnadze was quoted as saying to his staff at that time when they advised him not to back the United States in this matter. He said, well, Iraq may be a friend, but if your friend does something wrong, you have to call him up. I think it was Shevardnadze who convinced Gorbachev. There was also a story we heard later from Shevardnadze's assistant, Sergei Tarasenko, the one I quoted there, that when they got to Helsinki, that he and Dennis Ross, the American, worked out a statement, and they made just one copy, and they brought it into the meeting that Gorbachev was having with his advisors. And Yevgeny Primakov, who at that time was actually trying to replace Shevardnadze as foreign minister, was intriguing behind the scenes. They handed the copy to Gorbachev to approve, and Primakov said, let me see a copy of that. And they said, sorry, the Xerox machine's broken down, we don't have a copy. And so Gorbachev looked at it and signed off on it without any consultation with Primakov to take an issue. Later, Primakov tried to get involved. He knew he was an Arabist, he knew Saddam Hussein, and he wanted to go and, in effect, negotiate the issue. And we told Gorbachev, finally, look, if he can go and convince Saddam Hussein to leave Kuwait, fine, but we don't have, there's nothing else to negotiate. And actually, Gorbachev, before he let him go to Kuwait, he sent him to Washington to talk to Baker and Bush. Before he went to Kuwait, he did, and Saddam Hussein was adamant, he simply wouldn't move out of Kuwait. In the meantime, Shevardnadze in December resigned. It was unexpected on the outside, but he resigned very publicly in a speech in Parliament, saying that a dictatorship is coming and I am resigning. The people were rather shocked by that. I certainly was. I was out of Moscow that day, and when I heard the news, I came back in and I asked my deputy, did he really say he has resigned or he would? And he said, I am resigning. And so it looks like it was final. We kept checking with people like Tarasenko and others about his reasons, and he wasn't talking to us for a few days, that is Shevardnadze. And the story was that he felt that Gorbachev was not getting him full backing anymore on a number of issues, particularly some of the arms control issues. And he thought he might be dumped soon, and he was going to jump first. And I recall that in the spring of that year, 1990, when the whole question of Lithuanian independence had come up, he had called me in on just a one-on-one discussion of the situation. And as I left his office, I was struck by the fact that he said to me, you know, if I see violence coming, I'm going to resign. I don't want to be part of a government with blood on its hands. This was April or May of that year. Suddenly in December, he resigned. Well, you know, actually, Yevgeny Primakov wanted to replace him. I think Gorbachev knew very well that Primakov probably would not work well with us. And he finally named Alexander Besmirtnik, who at that time was Soviet ambassador in Washington and a good friend of ours, as the new foreign minister. So that this was all going on when there was, I would say, great turbulence within the Soviet Union domestically, because this was not only a time when Shevardnadze resigned, but Gorbachev had replaced a number of the people in senior positions who, with what seemed to be hardliners, called it his turn to the right in November of '90. So domestically, this was a very testy time, and in January you had an attack on the television tower in Vilnius, and gathering clouds of what could have been even a civil war domestically. So I think one of the things when we look at the diplomacy of this period, we have to remember that the people dealing with it, they couldn't segregate just this issue or that issue. Everything was happening at once. And we had all these very important foreign issues, but the Soviet Union itself was beginning to fall apart. And and of course, it meant that Gorbachev was being pulled in many different directions. However, he did stick with us as far as UN votes were concerned. When the Gulf War was all over, it took several months to assemble the coalition, and then when first we bombed for several days before we actually invaded, once we forced them out of Kuwait, we stopped the war. And that was what had been agreed with everyone in the coalition, that the reason for the war was to liberate Kuwait. It was not to remove Saddam Hussein or change the government in Baghdad. No. what I have assigned for reading, looks like I left that in the office. What I've assigned for reading, first of all, there are a group of case studies of the diplomacy. These are pretty detailed, but it gives you a very good idea of the enormous amount of diplomacy that went into putting this coalition together. We had not only had the UN approvals, which contained the phrase, the usual phrase, for authorizing military action to take all necessary means if Iraq did not voluntarily leave Kuwait. And this is always interpreted as military means in the last resort. But we also had a problem, if we could take it back to the invasion in Kuwait in August. We also had a problem domestically because there was strong opposition in Congress to using a military solution. Sam Nunn, who at that time I think was chairman of the Armed Forces Committee in the Senate, was against it, and for reasonable reasons. So, in effect, Bush had, first of all, to convince the Congress to vote in favor, while Baker organized our allies and virtually all the countries in the Middle East, the other Arab countries. This was the case of the coalition, included, I think, all the Arab countries except Jordan. Jordan was in a particular position. We tried to keep Israel out of it. We knew that would alienate the Arabs, so part of the pressure on Israel is to stay the heck out of that situation and let us organize everybody else. One aspect of the organization, I don't know whether we should be proud or ashamed, is that Baker negotiated so that other people paid for it. The Saudis, the Germans, the Japanese. The Germans and the Japanese did not involve themselves militarily, but they paid for it. And some said later we came out with a slight profit. I would hate to think that that's so, but it could be. So, but this was probably one of the, I would say, the most brilliant examples, if you are going to use force, how to do it right. We had UN authority, we had the backing of NATO, we had the backing of countries that were not in NATO, and we had the backing of the great majority of the countries in the region. That it met almost every requirement one could put for the use of military action. And as I said, once the action started, it was over fairly quickly, but not before Saddam Hussein had set fire to most of the oil wells in Kuwait. And this was a terrible problem. This was something that there was quite a migration from Texas of people who deal with oil well fires and putting those fires out. Tremendous environmental problem. Now, as you read through it, I think one of the things to pay attention to is the diplomacy, the motivation. What was the motivation? The motivation was to enforce the rule of law. That one country doesn't invade another and simply take it over by force. And that was to be one of the rules of the New World Order. Later, we'll look at George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq. And I think you'll see that almost everything he did the opposite of what his father did in the Gulf War. And so that's one reason we need to look at the two things. But I would also say that one of the things we started with the Gulf War was policy of trying to bring about regime change. Well, it hasn't worked. as we'll see then, and we've seen since. In this case, when Bush was asked, why didn't you take Baghdad and move Saddam Hussein? He said, we weren't authorized to do that. We were authorized to liberate Kuwait. We did what we were authorized and nothing more. And that way, we kept the coalition. This was also, I guess, one of the first times you had a pretty significant war and very, very few casualties. Again, air power was used. But even with the naval forces, we had NATO forces, French had ships there, you really had an international force to do this. At the time, it seemed to many of us this was absolutely essential. I don't know how your generation, looking ahead, will look back at it. Some could say that, look, so he has Kuwait. So let's get on. He's got to sell the oil, and so on. Kuwait was one of these, in effect, sheikdoms. A small family had sort of inherited the area and had all the wealth from it. It was not a democratic regime, and we set a precedent of, in effect, taking responsibility for peace and order in the Near East. I suspect that, there will be historians in the future who say that was a big mistake and one that started us on the course that later was good. That's not my view. I think at the time it made sense because at the time we were willing to get international sanction for what we were going to do it in concert with others, and to stop when you did what you said you were going to do. But it is something to think about as we go through other events later. Now, in the reading, in addition to the case studies that give us the diplomacy side of it, you'll be reading what Bush and Baker said about this. As usual, I like to start with what the people themselves have said about it. So far as our relations with the Soviets, when this was all over, a couple of months after it was over, Colin Powell, who was then chairman of the Joint Chiefs, came to Moscow and called on Gorbachev. Gorbachev looked across the table at him, and his first words were, "I feel sorry for you, General." And Powell said, "Mr. President, what do you have in mind?" And he says, "I've taken away your enemy. How are you going to get your appropriation next year?" Powell himself jokes about this now and recalls it. But then the next question Gorbachev asked was, George told me that you would reduce your presence at the Gulf to the level it was before the Kuwaiti invasion. Have you done that? And Powell said, more or less, yes. Well, we really hadn't. And that's sort of an interesting thing because we had left troops in Saudi Arabia. And it was those American troops in Saudi Arabia that gave bin Laden the incentive to start attacks on the United States. I point out these little sort of footnotes because the fact is, after that, if we had pulled out and not stayed in Saudi Arabia, it's entirely possible 9/11 would not have occurred. Because much of this is a reaction, their reaction to what they see us doing in the area. Any particular questions before we go into it now?
So, since the Soviet Union was an ally of Iraq, did they play any role in the negotiations between the United States and Saddam Hussein?
They did their best to get him to withdraw. As I said, they immediately, even the day after he went in, they gave a note demanding they withdraw. Yeah, so in that sense, they were not a formal ally in the sense that there was nothing like a NATO commitment. But they were the main military supplier of Saddam Hussein, and they had several thousand people there to maintain the equipment, to teach them how to use it, and so on. In fact, that's one of the things that we gave them time to get their dependents out before the war. It took several months to get the coalition together. This all started August 1st. And you know, the war didn't actually start until January of the next year, the actual action. But considering what was done, it was an amazing thing of putting this together. We had a number of demonstrations in Moscow. They kept them nonviolent, but the demonstrations were largely of students in Moscow from the area, not by Russians. But they had not just Iraqis, but a lot of Palestinians, and the Palestinians were at that point supporting the Iraqis, not surprisingly. But that's the reason Jordan had to stay out of the coalition against them. There were several of those demonstrations, but they were peaceful and they were largely not by Soviet citizens. Certainly the Soviet military looked at them as quasi-allies. You know, as we see today, maybe always, the feeling of prestige and maybe bragging rights are important to everybody, particularly to the military. And they knew very well if this goes to a fight, American weapons are going to wipe them out. And they really didn't want that to happen because it would have just looked bad again to all the other Arab countries that had their support. If you really get into a fight with the United States, you don't stand a chance. So they really didn't want to clash, and I would say Gorbachev did about all he could to do everything he could to get Saddam Hussein to get the